Great. I think we've got quorum now, and so we can go ahead.
Right.
So welcome everybody to the Aapti Roundtable on field research in the time of COVID-19. So just to give a quick introduction, Aapti Institute is a public research institution that looks at the intersection between technology and society. And as part of that, we are currently engaged in a couple of field pieces. And actually, we were on the brink of wrapping up field research in Chennai on last mile connectivity to the municipality when the lockdown hit. And we had to grapple with this change in circumstances and figure out how to adapt to this new changing world, and how do we continue to ask relevant questions and, you know, drive for evidence-based policy, but also keep in mind that a wide set of our participants actually are under a lot of existential stress right now. So when we were thinking about that, we realized that, you know, hey, why don't we involve more people in this research space, especially in development research, and try to understand how they're grappling with these breakdowns, and how do we what are the ways we can collectively understand this new changing methodology? Is it remote field work? If it's remote field work, how do we answer for ethics, and how do we answer for representativeness? So we thought of, starting this roundtable series. So that's something important that I have to mention, that this is the beginning of a series that we hope to do, and involve more research organizations, independent researchers, to see how they are navigating these very uncertain times. So just a quick couple of housekeeping points for the attendees. So if you have any questions, we have half an hour slotted by the end of this, session for attendees to ask questions. And we are not going to be looking primarily at the chat section, but we'll be downloading the chat later. If you have any links to post, you can go ahead. But for the questions, we'd like you to raise your hand. There's a raise your hand button that you can press, and one of the moderators will take your questions in the latter half of the session. So what we want to do is start off with each of our panelists to give a sense of how they are personally navigating this changing research methodology space, and what are the points that they're keeping in mind to ensure for ethics and representativeness. And after we've had each of them speak for about 10 minutes, we'll take questions and also discuss more meta questions around what is the future of field research. And while we are focusing on field research in general, that's both quantitative and qualitative research, we know that the implications for qualitative research are much more drastic, because it's more immersive in nature. And if we are shifting to remote, there's some considerations that we should keep in mind there. So I'll quickly introduce you to the panelists that we have. So we have Neha Raikar from Oxford Policy Management, India. We have Renuka Sane from NIPSP, the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy. And we've got Akash Patnaik from ID Insights. And we, I'm sorry, I think, okay, are you able to hear me? Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, and we have Shruti Vishwanathan from Athena Infonomics. So we're going to start off with Neha, and she can lead us through some of her work and, kick off the conversation. I will go on mute for now. All right, Neha, over to you.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions that we have today. So I am Neha Raikar. I am an economist by training. I have a PhD in economics, and my thesis was about school education, labor force participation rates of women. Public health is something that I started working on after finishing my PhD, when I started working in India. My first job was at Public Health Foundation of India, where I was working on a nutrition project that was a large consortium project on child nutrition. And then since then, I've been working on nutrition. I've been with OPM for the last 3 years. I lead some of the nutrition evaluations at the OPM India office. What I'm going to talk about today is one such evaluation. So let me share the screen and get started. Okay. All right, so this is work that we are doing for the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. They have a couple of programs in Rajasthan that are targeting child nutrition and maternal health. This is one of the projects that we are evaluating in Rajasthan for them. It's a mixed methods evaluation. The team involved is myself. I lead the project, and then there's Jasmeet, Umang, and Tom. And I think Umang is attending this webinar today. So what I'm going to talk about is just to give you a sense of what the program is originally and what is the evaluation design, and then how that has been impacted because of the developments with COVID that we've seen since March. To just give you a gist of the program, because I think it's very important to understand the context of the program before we get into the challenges and how COVID has impacted the evaluation. So this is a program called Born Healthy, which is being funded by the Children's Investment Fund Foundation and being implemented by Jaigo in 4 districts of Rajasthan. We are doing the evaluation in one of the treatment districts. There are 2 main intervention components of this program. One is the introduction of comprehensive point-of-care diagnostics at ANC delivery sites, and especially at the outreach level, right? So ANC is antenatal care, and so what these point-of-care diagnostics do is that they will now be used by the ANMs at the outreach level to actually do the tests for certain maternal infections. So usually what happens is the ANM at most collects slides or takes blood samples, sends them to the PHC, and then that takes a lot of time in getting the woman tested before she can be referred for treatment. So what these point-of-care diagnostics do is that they expedite the testing process for certain maternal infections that Jaigo has identified to be key in these areas. So they are providing the ANMs with the point-of-care diagnostics at the outreach level, so which means at the sub-center, and also to be administered at the VHSNDs, which in Rajasthan are called MCHN days, which are the maternal child health and nutrition days, which happen once a month in a village. The other component, which is also a big important component of the program, is the training and mentoring of health workers. So they are not only given the point of care diagnostics, but they're also, the ANMs are also given training on how to improve the quality of antenatal care services. Not just the ANMs, but the ASHAs and Anganwadi workers are also given a day of orientation to improve the quality of ANC that is being offered through the outreach level. And then they are also training the medical officers to test better, to refer better, and in general improve the quality of ANC services in these areas. So the idea is that these 2 interventions will then improve quality of antenatal care services, but also increase demand over time for antenatal care services. And then eventually the target impact indicator is prevalence of low birth weight. The idea is that all these interventions, if delivered at quality and at scale and on time, will reduce the prevalence of low birth weight. OPM is conducting a mixed methods impact evaluation of this program. Our objective is to assess the impact of the Born Healthy program on prevalence of low birth weight, and there are also other birth outcomes, such as, say, stillbirth or preterm births, and we use a quasi-experimental matched case design. So it's a bit of a complicated design, but I won't go into too much details about that because in the interest of time. But what we've done is match districts and blocks, and so for the treatment district, which in our case is Dholpur, we found a matched district, which is Bharatpur, and a matched block, and we are carrying out the study in 1 block each of the treatment and control area. So here's what we are doing. So we did a baseline in 2018 before this program was implemented, before the implementation began. Now what we are doing is, since it's been almost a year since the program has been rolled out, we are now conducting a cohort study of pregnant women. So what this is doing is that this will allow us to collect secondary data, data on secondary outcomes, because it's things like, say, weight gain during pregnancy, or changes in anemia prevalence during pregnancy, or changes in health practices, diet diversity because of better counseling that is provided by the trained health workers. All of those are important to capture, and those you can't necessarily capture through repeated cross-sectional rounds, because that is different set of observations every time. So we are setting up a cohort so that we can track these women over time. So women are recruited into the cohort as soon as their pregnancy is confirmed, and then we track their pregnancy over time. So approximately every 2 months, we interview them again. We do these follow-up interviews until a few days after delivery. So after about 20 days of delivery, we go back to these women and do the final interview, which is approximately the 4th interview, where we collect information on the neonatal outcomes, birth outcomes, where did they deliver, how was the delivery, etc. Right, so this is being carried out in Dhulpur, and like I said, the matched control block is Bharatpur. What is really important to remember about this cohort is that this is a continuous data collection process. So every month, new confirmed pregnancies keep getting added to the cohort, and then women start dropping off from the cohort once they've completed about 20 days, 25 days after delivery. So it's a moving cohort, so to speak. The original idea was to do this for 2 years, starting October last year. And we were going to go on with this until December 2021. So that's assuming about 24 months of program exposure for women who are recruited into the cohort. And then every month there will be new women who keep getting added. The two main things that in-person interviews were allowing us to do here was that, as you all know, with antenatal care services, a big problem with data collection is that a lot of it is self-reported by women, and sometimes that is subject to a lot of reporting error. The way we understand, the way researchers understand antenatal care is very different, or may be very different from the way respondents understand antenatal care. And therefore, what we also do as a part of our interviews is verify their health records with their MCP cards, right? So most women either have the MCP cards themselves, or their ANMs retain the MCP cards of these women. So in either case, we verify what they are saying, what the self-reported information is, with the MCP record. So that is something that really must be done in person, and that is something that our field team does every time we go to visit them and get a record of their ANC services. The other thing that we do is also we undertake measurements of these women. So every time we go to them for an interview, we measure their weight and we measure their hemoglobin levels, right? Because that is also something that we want to rely on our own measurements for, because that's also subject to, you could be subject to measurement error, or could be subject to data entry error on the MCP card. So that's something that we are, because we're closely tracking these secondary outcomes, we are collecting that information ourselves. So these are sort of the two important things that we are doing in person, which are obviously affected because of the COVID pandemic. Our team of enumerators is stationed in these areas. So we have enumerators who are staying currently in Dhulpur and Bharatpur, very close to these field sites, so very close to the villages that we have identified for this evaluation. And therefore, they continue to stay there, and it's easy for them to keep tracking these women and keep going to them every time they're due for the next interview. So it's sort of quite resource-intensive exercise to keep a field team continuously engaged on this evaluation in the field at all. So given the nature of this design, you can imagine that COVID has played a big role in the way in the way this has changed our outlook to our ongoing field work. First of all, in-person surveys had to be halted since March 2020, right before the national lockdown began. So obviously, recruitment of new women and follow-up of existing women who are already in our cohort has been halted. From October, that's when we started the cohort. Since October 2019 until March, we had finished recruiting about 518 women in our cohort. Out of those, about 180 have had a second interview, and then by then there was this lockdown. So we have at best the first interview which was done for 518 women, and the second interview was done for about 180 of those women, right? So considerable a number of women in that sample have not been followed up since. The field team has been residing in the study area since lockdown. They're away from their families. Most of them are from Madhya Pradesh, and they've not been able to go back home. So to keep them occupied, to keep them motivated without any field work and far away from their homes with the current anxiety around COVID has been a challenge, because now cases are on the rise in that part of Rajasthan as the migrants have started returning to work. So we are also very aware of their mental health and their their sort of anxiety and concerns around work. The other issue that is going to be a problem for our evaluation is that public provision of routine ANC services themselves have been halted. So there has been no ANC service delivery at all in these areas. We are constantly in touch with the ANMs and ASHAs in these areas to find out what is happening. But as of the end of May, there were no ANC services whatsoever being given. A few CHCs were offering some services, but women were unable to access these. For, say, they need a TT shot, for example, to go all the way to a CHC without any transportation was very, very difficult for them. So there have been a lot of challenges that we hear about in the field. Since June, there has been some sort of ANC being offered at the outreach level, and by that I mean that the government of Rajasthan has issued orders to start the MCHN days, which are the monthly VHSN days that we all know in the other states. That is something that the government has started, but with a lot of restrictions. So there are restrictions on how many women can assemble, and restrictions around how to conduct them for large groups of women. So we expect that the quality of ANC and access to ANC services at the outreach level are going to remain altered for a very long time. This also therefore has implications for the Born Healthy program, because Jopaigo program officers continuously visit these areas, provide mentoring support to the ANMs and ASHAs to offer ANC services. So if they cannot go to the field, and if the nature of services offered is being changed, then that definitely has implications for how we had defined the program and what we knew of the program design to begin with. So currently what we're doing is we're pivoting our existing project to collect certain COVID-related information. We also want to assess how ANC services are being delivered now that we know that there are some relaxations to the lockdown, and some services may have resumed in a partial sort of way. We want to understand what is exactly happening in the villages and what kind of services are being provided at the outreach level. However, we are aware that we will not be able to use this data for our final evaluation, right? So by end line, we were hoping for a certain sample of women to be covered under the cohort study, but that we will almost certainly have to exclude the observations that we will be including in the telephonic surveys that we are trying to launch very soon, because there are going to be issues around data quality, comparability of indicators that we had collected in person versus the ones that we will collect over the phone. There is likely to be non-response, because that's natural, that's how it is with telephone surveys. Plus, we cannot collect all the indicators that we collected in person, because we had to considerably reduce the length of the questionnaire. And therefore, we are aware that it's comparing apples to oranges if we start comparing what we collected through in-person interviews with what we are collecting over the telephone. And therefore, we are going to lose the entire 518 observations from our in-person. However, we still think this is important to do, even if telephonically, because we want to understand the nature of ANC services, the challenges that women are facing in access to routine services, also because we know from the community health workers that there are a large number of new pregnancies in these areas. So if we are not being able to avail antenatal care services, what is going to happen to them, and how is it going to affect maternal health during pregnancy? We want to understand how routine ANC services have resumed, what nature does it take now, what are its implications for Born Healthy, and how we define program exposure. We want to assess knowledge and awareness of COVID among women. What are they doing for precautions? What do they understand? What are their sources of information? And finally, to understand their general access to social safety nets, food security issues, health and nutrition services in general, right? In terms of, say, take-home ration, etc. So we are still going ahead with this, but we are aware that there are a lot of challenges. We had to alter the questionnaire design, we had to alter the length of the questionnaire considerably. It's also difficult to collect certain complex indicators that we were otherwise quite comfortable collecting in person. And these are especially to do with clinical services related to antenatal care, right? Women are often unable to differentiate between the different tests that are performed with them. They are unable to they are unable to really recall their obstetric history, because you don't get the kind of time to probe those over the telephone the way you would do that in person. So we understand that it is going to be difficult to include a lot of these complex indicators around antenatal care. Counseling is the other one, right? We can't, it's very difficult for them to recall the topics that were covered through counseling, if at all, unless the interviewer is actually present and helping them, sort of jog down their memory. There are also challenges with the actual fieldwork part of it, not just the design part of it, but the actual fieldwork as well, because we can't verify self-reported information. Like I said, our system was to verify their self-reported information with MCP cards, which we cannot do anymore. We cannot measure the women ourselves, and therefore we won't get a measure of hemoglobin and their weight during pregnancy. Non-verbal communication is extremely important. Our enumerators are very well trained. They have a lot of experience in in-person interviews, and therefore they have been very successful at getting a lot of information of sensitive nature from these women so far. But we expect that is not going to be as smooth in case of a telephone interview. We also know that monitoring data collection is going to be sort of tricky now, because all the interviews are going to happen remotely. We are thinking of putting measures in place, but we know that it's not going to be as good as, say, us being in the field at all times monitoring the interviews. The other sort of classic problem is around response rate and representativeness of the sample. In our case, our sampling frame is the telephone numbers that they provided at the time of their first interview. Right, so we are not recruiting any new women into the sample through the telephone interviews. We will only be using that sampling frame of 518 women that we first recruited in the cohort. Because recruiting new women, calling up complete strangers over the phone and asking information on their pregnancy and antenatal care is going to be very, very challenging. So we are only doing this for women who are already in our cohort. So in that sense, we know what that sampling frame is going to look like, and they have all given us their telephone numbers, but we are aware that contacting them over the telephone is not going to be as easy, because very often the telephone actually belongs to another relative or a male member in the household. And so what do we do in situations like that? We have put in place, again, measures and scripts that our enumerators can use to talk to the relatives and ensure that the phone is handed to the respondent that we're interested in, but we know that may not always work out as perfectly as we would want. And then, of course, there are issues around completion of interview, if the woman has to suddenly go for some other household work, etc. We have some measures in place, but I can talk about those later when we come to the discussion. So I'll stop here for now, and I will hand it over to Lakshmi.
Thank you, Neha. I think you bring up a couple of very interesting points around mental health and trying to capture access gaps in the current, tumultuous time as well. And that's very important to keep in mind. So I'll just quickly go over to, Shruti, would you like to go next?
Sure.
Or,
Sure. I can go next. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach than what Neha did, right? I'm going to talk about how we've sort of thought about issues around fieldwork, especially qualitative research during COVID, and what are the key questions that have come up. I was speaking to Sario earlier, and I was saying I was quite excited to be part of this discussion, because I'm looking forward to listening to what solutions and ideas that everybody else here has come up with too. A lot of us here are familiar with evaluative frameworks, so I'm going to try and use that to walk you through how we've thought about at Athena Infonomics, how we've thought about qualitative fieldwork in this time. And really the first metric that we've looked at is relevance, right? How relevant is the qualitative fieldwork that we were looking to conduct? And what are additional ideas or that we want to sort of think about right now. Do we want to pivot our research questions? Do we want to drop it? Which is also completely okay. I'll give you an example of a project that we've been working on around anti-trafficking. And our role there was as an evaluator to work with 10 implementing partners that the donor had funded and to evaluate the different projects that they were running. Obviously, with COVID, the ability to implement those programs and evaluate them changed a lot. And we worked with the donor to sort of change our role more from an evaluator to a learning partner. So we worked with the donor to help the different implementing partners go back to the drawing board and change their strategies, keeping in mind how COVID had impacted their original strategies. We also worked on rapid learning notes around gender, around migrants and COVID, etc., to help set a little bit of a theoretical framework around how COVID was impacting them, how COVID was impacting trafficking in the region, and then worked with the implementing agencies more to sense check their revised strategies rather than to evaluate the program. And what really helped for us in this was having a donor who was incredibly flexible and who was quick to respond and work with us and the implementing partners in rethinking the strategy of it. So really the first question that we've been asking ourselves is relevance. And if we don't think the research that we're doing is incredibly relevant to COVID right now, is there something else that we could be working on with our existing partners and with our existing donors that would be more useful to them? There's a lot of talk around adaptive evaluations these days, and I'm sure we'll get to that in the discussion. But it really depends on the flexibility of the research team, but also the flexibility of the different partners and donors that you're working with. I think qualitative research is uniquely positioned to sort of respond to COVID more than quantitative research, because qualitative research, I mean, at the core of it is the idea that it's about the participant, their lived experience, their experience of either a sector or a program, depending on what we're looking at, and they take center stage in qualitative research, right? So sort of molding qualitative research around a participant's expectations and their lived experience becomes easier, and research methods and design we find are generally more flexible, which has helped in this case. I think the one thing that we sort of took away from this was to be unafraid to question why we were doing some research and whether it was relevant or not. And it's okay to say that, you know, this might not be the right time and the right place to ask the questions we wanted to, and to park that for a later date. So having, in some ways, the ability to question our own, you know, existence and the existence of our research, and to be able to say sometimes that it's not valid and that's okay, it's not relevant right now, and we sort of need to think about and pivot our strategies there. So that's one question that we've been really thinking about a lot with a lot of our projects. And I mean, each solution has been specific to the context, but it's depended on the context of the project, it's depended on the different partners that we work with, and the flexibility of all the parties involved in the project. The second question that I sort of want to talk about is representation, right? And the effectiveness of the research. So let's say we said our research was relevant, we've added and modified our questions, but now we want to see if there's an effective way to conduct that research. And this for us has really depended on the type of stakeholders. In qualitative research that centers around key informant officials, whether they're with the government, whether they're with a program, whether they're with a local organization, where there's an identifiable respondent, some interactions via WhatsApp, etc. with them. I think where we've really struggled is where there isn't an identifiable respondent, right? So let's say a beneficiary. We're looking at a scheme around skilling and livelihoods. We think it's really relevant. We want to speak to the beneficiaries of this program, but how do we identify them? And what sort of bias exists in the respondents that we do manage to identify? We've tried to do different snowballing sampling approaches, spoken to different people to identify beneficiaries under program. But we're also cognizant that the people that we are able to speak to, or possibly people who have access to either a phone or a computer and can access technology, can log into it, and are comfortable interacting over technology. And that automatically biases our sample a little, right? So that's something we've struggled with. There are different strategies we've used, especially in working with local partners to identify variance in beneficiaries, but I'm not convinced that we have a perfect solution. I would love to hear what other ideas everyone today has sort of worked with. I think the other thing that we sort of want to talk about a little bit here is the dangers associated with conducting interviews via Skype or a phone, right? Assuming that the people we're speaking to are within a household or in an office, within a closed space. And if the topic that we're talking about is sensitive, what happens to the response, right? So I'll give you an example, which is, let's say we're talking about domestic violence, and we're trying to work with beneficiaries of a program to understand, how the program has shaped, how domestic violence in COVID has sort of played out. What can the program do to help them deal with this during this really difficult period? But obviously, if they're within a household, there are lots of their responses will be moderated. There are consequences to being heard speaking about domestic violence, right? So one of the ideas that that we had discussed with the partner was to use code words, to not actually say domestic violence, but can we use other words to still discuss what we want to, and to be very sensitive about the repercussions of talking about sensitive topics, and also being heard talking about sensitive topics. What is the setting in which you're conducting this interview? What is the nature of your research? And thinking through how this might impact the beneficiary. So that's something that's really occupied us a lot. The other sort of question that we've looked at is data quality, right? I want to be clear, like Neha mentioned, that this isn't just about changing the medium. So it's not just shifting from an in-person interview to shifting to a telephonic or Skype or Zoom interview. It has to be more than just the medium. And the one thing that we've realized in sort of restructuring our research and doing pilots over phone and Skype is that the length of our interviews has really come down. I think while we are traditionally used to having 30, 40, maybe even 60-minute interviews, that's not gone down so well over the phone. There are some respondents, of course, who are able to engage for such a period of time. But what we've had to restructure our research and our research questions to the bare minimum. So what we're looking at is a 10 to 15-minute window. What are the core questions that we do absolutely want to know more about? And that's meant discarding a lot of things that we spent a lot of time coming up with, a lot of different questions, a lot of different areas of interest. It's been hard, but I think it's been a good rethink on what forms the core of the research, what is absolutely necessary, what can we ask in a sensitive way, and condense that to a 10 to 15-minute interview. The last thing that I sort of want to talk about is looking at data quality across the research value chain. I think often in these conversations, we're sort of focused on data collection, right? How do we conduct these interviews? How do we locate stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera? But I think that it's important to look at the research value chain as like piloting, developing our research questions. It's about training the people who will be asking the questions, whether it's us, research associates, enumerators, etc. And then data collection and how that piece works. And I've spoken a little bit about data collection. I've spoken a little bit about piloting and how we've had to restructure a lot of our research questions. I did want to end with talking a little bit about training and how we've looked at video options for training. So it's difficult to do a 9-to-5 training with any research associate set or an enumerator set, right? So pre-recorded videos, conducting video exercises, conducting exercises over Google Forms and Google Survey forms, and recognizing that enumerators and researcher associates are also under lockdown. They need more flexibility, especially if they're caregivers, working a little bit more around their schedules. So coming up with more creative ways to train the people on the research, thinking about their flexibility and their schedule has also been important in the research value chain. I think I've sort of taken up my 10 minutes now. I'll give it back to Lakshmi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shruti, for the very lucid, take on. You kind of covered all the 360-degree concerns that from researchers who design things and to the last mile participants, and it's very helpful. I think in the discussion round we can talk more about the innovation within methodology that researchers need to come up with. That's very interesting that you brought that up. But I'll give the mic to, I think, Akash or Renuka, who wants to go next. Akash, would you like to go next? Or Renuka? I think
I can go next.
Great. All right.
Yes. So, thank you for having me here. I think my response is very different from the previous two speakers, partly because we were in a stage of research where we could easily not abandon, but really postpone whatever it is that we were planning to do. And just wait for a better time, if you will, to conduct the research. So I want to say two things. So let me just give you a brief overview of what it is that we were trying to do. So we are currently doing a project where we are interested in grievance redress frameworks in financial markets. So if you have a bank account, you have a ATM card, or you have some insurance scheme and you want to complain about something that has not worked, then do you even access the formal redress system? What happens when you access it? If you don't access it, why is it that you don't access it? So we wanted to understand the extent of complaints out there with respect to financial products, and what is the experience of people when it comes to use of these formal grievance redress systems. And towards that end, starting February, we had started doing focus group discussions with a bunch of people, right, starting from women who are SHG group members to slightly, more affluent people who are, say, college professors or college students, all of whom will have financial products, but will likely have a very different experience, not just because they have very different financial products in their portfolio, but also because their ability to access formal financial systems is going to be very different. So we've done about 5-6 FGDs, and we were about to start our pilots to design the questionnaire so that we could go into the field and figure this out, at which point, this whole lockdown struck. And because, so on one hand, it would be very interesting to know that under conditions of a lockdown, what happens with the way you access financial products and what happens with the way you access formal grievance redress systems, because presumably it's even more important now that your ATM card works, because it's harder to go to the bank branch and collect money, or it's even more important that there are no problems with your mobile money transfer, because it's that much harder to solve problems in person. So that would have been very good, to measure these things during the survey. But we decided to not pursue it because it just felt that impossible, or to be honest, to be going into the field at this point. And because we hadn't even started, we were just kind of getting our pilots ready. It was easier for us to put a stop and say, we're just going to resume this once the air clears and we are able to go in the field. So having said that, what this has also done is it has made us think about different ways of collecting this information. So one is we are paying more attention to secondary data now than we were. So for example, we got data from Twitter feeds, and we said, that's a metric of the kind of complaints that people are facing, because anytime you have a complaint with the bank, you go file a tweet and say whatever you have to say, or rant however you want to rant on Twitter. And so we've collected very interesting data on the kind of complaints that have come before COVID and after COVID, and especially during the lockdown. So that has been sort of one pivot that we've done, saying, how can we use secondary sources of data to answer the same question. And of course, maybe this analysis will help us refine what we go and ask in the field whenever it is that we are able to do so. And the second thing that we are exploring now, and I don't have answers to this, and I would love to hear your thoughts and comments, is trying to use phone surveys and trying to use kind of stories from people about where is it that things went wrong. So it's much harder to kind of ask on the phone, did you have a problem with your bank ATM card, or did you have a problem with XYZ? These are much more difficult to ask on the phone. So what might be easier is to say, tell us what happened. And it need not even be a complaint, and we might just hear a story about what happened. And once we gather that kind of a data, maybe we can use some statistical techniques to figure out what it is that is going on. So where we don't kind of ask the question directly, we just try and source information and stories from people about their experience with the financial system, the formal financial system, and then try and draw inferences in this particular period. And of course, then once the air clears, we will go back to the field. We don't want to do a phone survey because we feel that, right now, since we were not in the middle of anything, it was easier for us to not start at all. And our donors have also been kind enough to let us postpone the survey to maybe year end or early next year, when it is that we can actually go on the field. So, any thoughts on how to do phone surveys, on how to capture people's stories on the phone? That would be very interesting to us, because that is the kind of stuff that we are exploring now. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Renuka. I think you've done a good job of presenting the conundrum between, being able to capture people's anxieties and breakdowns in this moment, while also not just, focusing on anecdotal evidence, and buttressing it with, data that can actually inform policy. So that's a great point. I think the reason for having such conversations is to kind of get a sense of what everybody else is doing and sort of navigate it together. So with that, I'll hand it over to Akash. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I can give a quick introduction of myself and then present a short presentation that we prepared. So I'm Akash. I've been working with ID Insight now for the past 4 years, and I'm currently working as a manager on our data on demand team that specializes on improving data collection methods. So I'll quickly share my screen and walk you through a brief presentation. Neha, it's I think the host has disabled sharing of the screen. Could you just
Sorry, just give me a second.
Akash, it should work now. Sorry, you're here. That's right.
Yeah, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, I thought I'll walk you through 4 quick things. The first is an overview of what we do at ID Insight, what specifically is our data on demand model and how we've adapted it to phone surveys. A specific question that the Aapti team had asked around how do we think about data quality assurance at this time? And finally, all the innovative work that we're doing to try and further enhance the future of data collection. So ID Insight, our mission is to use data and evidence to help leaders combat poverty worldwide. And we originally started off as an organization that focuses using randomized control trials to help leaders make better decisions. But over the years, we've learned that there are other solutions that are really critically required by policymakers, things like machine learning, rapid data collection, process evaluations, qualitative data collection. So over the year, we've tried to build a broad analytical toolkit that can help this decision maker make better policies. And in India, we've been working for the past 8 years and have a presence across 15 states. I'll come to the data on demand model that actually links from how we went from just doing decision focused evaluations to having a broader suite of services. And one thing that we realized is that policymakers right now often lack timely and accurate data to make policy decisions. Data collection activities are often very expensive, they're infrequent, often inaccurate, and also at times inaccessible. And so we've tried to solve for these issues and really tried to build in-person and remote services that optimize across quality, speed, and cost to be able to give actionable insights to our partners. And the way we've tried to do this is build this on a backbone of a strong collection infrastructure, having flexible data systems that can be deployed rapidly for any survey, and finally, a hyper focus on maintaining quality. So essentially, how have we adapted this specifically for phone surveys? So what our phone survey system looks like is we have our core team of project specialists that includes economists, associates, managers, field managers who have experience with data collection and quantitative methods, who then manage a network of distributed state and district coordinators, who then in turn manage over 1,000 data agents at the district and sub-district level. And the way we've been able to set this up is through a very strong backbone of having an innovations team that is really working to come up with what are the best cutting edge technologies that can be deployed to enhance our operational excellence. And with respect to that, I thought for today's roundtable, I'll keep the focus on how we've tried to maintain that quality specifically for remote surveys. So starting off, I think the first thing that we learned is data quality management at scale is really important. The three main sources that we identified that can be sources of error is one is just a systematic misunderstanding or miscommunication of survey questions. This is something that we think can exist both for phone surveys as well as in-person surveys. The second is falsification of responses. This is again something that we think can happen in both. And finally, with misentry of responses, wherein someone accidentally typed something that they weren't intending to, instead of writing 100, someone wrote 1,000. All of these essentially tie into having poor quality data, and that poor quality data then limits our ability to make impactful policy decisions. With respect to remote surveys, some of these obviously get amplified. Something like miscommunication of a survey question becomes a lot worse on a phone survey as opposed to an in-person survey, because you can't read the respondent's body language. You can't really go ahead and get a much better sense of how well someone is comprehending based on facial expressions. So you really need to go by how well you're understanding their voice tone. So at that point, we think it's even more important to focus on quality. And how do these concerns really change at scale? So I think what we've been thinking about is, if it's a very small team that you're trying to train for a very specific survey, it's a lot easier to maintain quality. But often the needs of decision makers and academic researchers are ones where they require huge amounts of data collected across different geographies. And at that level, we've seen that the first level of problems is, given that training and monitoring needs to be decentralized, that can lead to a lot of variation. The second is surveyors have to navigate a really wide range of education levels, local dialects, different contexts, and that creates other challenges. And then surveying conditions are highly variable. Now, with respect to remote surveys, the conditions, the physical conditions don't vary that much, but there'll be a lot of variation in connectivity levels, digital literacy, elements like family backgrounds. Are families willing to pass on the phones to female respondents? Who does the phone number lie with? So there are multiple different conditions that surveyors need to contend with, and this can again bring in a lot of variation in quality. And so we learned that high quality data then becomes pretty difficult to manage at scale, and specifically for phone surveys. So I'll start off with in general, what were the principles of data quality that we started with, and then talk through how essentially we modified them with respect to phone surveys. So what we thought about was firstly thinking about data collection activities by thinking about what are the stages in a survey life cycle. So what do you do before the survey, what do you do during the survey, and what do you do after the survey? At the first level, in terms of before the survey, you can do your best to try and prevent errors. So this is making sure that surveyor incentives are aligned to balance quality and productivity, making sure that you have robust training mechanism, and you also have a very strong form design. During the survey, you can actively check the data in different ways. You can have data quality checks, which are coded through different systems like Stata or Excel or any platform like Python or anything that might work for you. Doing spot checks, which is visiting surveys in the middle of a live survey, and back checks, which is resurveying a household to see if there's a mismatch between the original survey and then the second survey. But just doing all these different checks often is not enough. I think what we've learned is that there's a really strong emphasis required on feedback loop. So what we've developed is we've developed live quality dashboards and productivity dashboards that allow our field teams to filter by their district, by their surveyors to assess quality. And they use that information both for in-person debriefs, but also for one-on-one calls. And finally, we send automated emails to our surveyors to be able to assess their quality. And what do we do at the end of the survey? At the end of the survey, the one thing that we've been able to do is look at, is there any data point that needs to be corrected? And we corrected that using audio files, photo files, doing direct phone calls with the respondents, or at times in-person visits. So these are the broad principles with which we've looked at data quality in general. But how have we modified this specifically with respect to phone surveys? So at the first level, in terms of training, here there's a big difference because now a lot of the training needs to be completely remote. And to maintain that standardization is even more important. So the way we do training is we rely on having all data, all training material developed centrally through training videos and quizzes. So all districts essentially are watching the same videos and giving the same quizzes. And we use quizzes as that feedback mechanism to inform us whether these teams are ready. The next change is on the during survey piece. Is we no longer can do any spot checks or phone survey, but what we've done is we've really amped up the amount of audio audits that we do. So we collect audio files for nearly 100% of our surveys, and then we try and back check as many of them as possible. The next piece is we've modified our quality dashboards to have additional metrics on things like non-response, on things like surveys that were dropped off in the middle, half complete. So a lot of phone survey specific metrics that teams can use for their debriefs. The next thing that we've done is on an in-person survey, often timelines are much wider. So for instance, you might be doing a survey that goes on for a month. Given that phone surveys can be done a lot faster, that also means that you're finishing through the proportion of your sample a lot faster, which means that within 2 days, you could be 50% into your total sample. And let's say on the second day, if you find that there was a big error that teams were making, you've compromised 50% of your data, which necessitates far more regular debriefs and conversations. And finally, in terms of correction of data, along with doing phone calls with respondents and using the audio files, we also put a lot of emphasis on using appropriate sampling weights, which could be non-response weights or post-stratification weights, to ensure that we can account for the bias that might be creeping in because of certain amounts of attrition. So that's how we've tried to modify these systems for a phone survey. And obviously, I'd like to add that we're still trying to learn this as much as everyone else. So far, we've done around 3 or 4 large surveys in the last month, 2 with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and 1 with the World Bank, with a focus on collecting data on COVID-19 response, knowledge, attitudes, and preferences, and also economic impact. And what we've seen is that some of these systems over time are definitely giving us more learnings on how often we need to debrief, how much do we need to focus on non-response, what are other ways that we can track data quality. I'll end by talking through quickly how we want to take all of these systems and continuously improve them so that we can really minimize data quality and also automate as many of our processes as possible. So essentially, we at ID Insight have an innovations team that is working on a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to focus on innovations in data collection methods. And as I said earlier, all of these innovations aren't only to produce public goods, they're also meant to tie into our current operations so that we can rapidly improve our systems. So the 4 things that we've been focusing on is having a dedicated team thinking about how we can improve phone surveys. So what we've been doing is running a lot of operational pilots and experiments to see things like, what is the optimal time of day to call a respondent? How many times should you call a respondent? How often do male respondents pass the phone to female respondents, and other such experiments. And what we've been trying to do is very regularly publish all of those findings on our ID Insight blog. So do check out those articles. They're very good guides in terms of how you can run your own phone survey. The next piece that we've been working on is how can we use machine learning to predict data quality? And this is something that ties back to what I was talking about with respect to how fast surveys go when you're doing them remotely, just because it takes a lot less time per survey. We think that in the long run, it will be critical to have systems that allow you to almost real time predict if there's an error in the survey. To some extent, this can be done by building in basic logical checks or checks on constraints. But really, a big part of why errors happen are because of miscommunication, surveyors not following protocol. And we really need to be able to have a system to be able to predict where that kind of error is happening. So we have a team that's been using training data sets that we've developed through our different surveys to build an algorithm that can be used for both in-person and phone surveys. Next, we have our data systems team, which is focusing on how to automate different operational processes. Things like, how do we have a robust tracking system? How can we run all these data checks in an automated fashion? How can we send out emails and assignments to surveyors almost real time? And so we have a data systems team that's really trying to use their engineering backgrounds to help us build out that strong operational backbone. And finally, on the sampling front, I think one constraint that I'm sure others are also grappling with is often, all of us have limited access to panels, which we've collected through our in-person activities. How do we expand these panels? How do we reach out to as many more people as possible? And so our sampling team is really investing time into looking at alternative sampling frames that can be leveraged for different phone surveys. So in essence, what we've been trying to do is continuously try and improve our systems through regular operations, but also have an R&D backbone so that we can improve how data collection and remote surveys are done as a whole. And with a larger objective of obviously making as much of that public and helping the sector learn about this as well. Yeah, I'll stop there and hand over.
Thank you so much, Akash. I think you've done a very good job of laying out a roadmap for, really sort of looking inward on how to navigate data quality questions, especially for quantitative research and quantitative data in particular. I think, to continue asking these relevant questions in this time is important as researchers, be it quantitative or qualitative. And I think that's very useful, the presentation that you've, given. And I urge everybody to also look at their blog on how to look at telephone surveys, qualitative telephone surveys as well. It's rather useful. I think, we've completed the panelist presentation portion, and it's very interesting to see the wide range of responses that we've got. And what I wasn't, what I didn't expect to hear going into this, and that's kind of, rather naive now that I think about it, is the question of the general well-being and mental health of the enumerators, because that impacts the quality of data collected as well, and that's something that I know a lot of people are also navigating. And also the second thing is the flexibility of research design itself, and that's where people like us come into the forefront. And I think Shruti's point of knowing what to sort of let go of, as heartbreaking as it might be for research designers, is also an important thing to keep in mind given the current situation. And that leads me into the first discussion point for today's panel. And as of now, I think we're taking questions. One of the moderators are going to take your questions and unmute the attendees as and when we get them. But in the meantime, I want the panelists and the attendees and everybody to think about, how do we continue to ask these relevant questions while being mindful of existential stressors? I think initially some conversations with ID Insight that I previously had talked about, creating resources for participants to use after each survey. So that's one way of looking at it. And, as researchers, having the research spirit of curiosity and also this problem solving need means that, we want to keep asking these questions and not, give up on our participants in a way. So I would love to hear more about, these kind of measures that people have taken, or, researchers have taken, and also taking questions from the attendees. So yeah, I'll open the floor to anybody who wants to answer to this. Yeah.
So anyone who wants to ask a question, can you please use the option of like raise hand, so that I'll just unmute them and you can ask the question. And it would be also be helpful if you could have questions towards particular panelists, you could direct the questions to them. Yeah.
I can start with one question that's come up in
MM's iPhone has raised a question. Should I? Yeah, I'll just unmute you. Yeah.
Yeah, you can unmute them and they can go for it. MM's iPhone?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have unmuted you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my question is already stated in the chat. I just wanted to understand why sample size and sample targets should be affected. I think the last panelist was speaking about sampling, and I was wondering why it has to be affected. Can't the field research still be conducted, still targeting the particular size and persons or respondents? That's just a question.
Can I
Hello?
answer that? I think, one of the biggest problems is the question of attrition. Because suppose before the lockdown, you started with a sample size of 100, and then you decided that you were going to, call everybody, but you're only able to call 50. Your worry is that the 50 that you're missing out, is there a systematic pattern to missing them out? Like, are you missing out the poorer people who don't have phones? Or are you missing out people with no agency and hence cannot answer questions on phone? And this will vary depending on whatever your situation is. So I really worry about attrition when we are doing phone surveys. And then if we expect, even if the attrition is random and we expect a certain proportion of attrition, I think that the sample size would have to increase, because if you want the effect size to be whatever it is that you want, the power of the study to be whatever it is that you want, then you may just have to increase your sample size when you switch to a telephonic survey, because you'd expect that attrition would be a lot more. So I think that, a design that was made prior to the lockdown may have to be rethought when now you are in lockdown mode. So if you're starting afresh in a lockdown mode, it's different. But, if you're in the middle of a survey and this happens and your design was based on parameters that were prior to the lockdown, then I think that it's a larger struggle to get it right. I hope this answers some of the questions.
Yeah, that's helpful.
If your questions are being answered, can you please lower your hand? And anyone else, if you have questions, can you please raise your hand so that I could unmute you and you could ask the questions directly to the panelists? Yeah, just a minute.
We have been getting some questions from the chat. I'll just pose one. I think I'll pick this one up because it's part of the discussion as well. So somebody, Arpana, has asked, would also like to know some ethical considerations while conducting research during the pandemic. So what I'm curious to know about is, have any of you or your enumerators come across participants who express distress in this time, and if so, how have your enumerators navigated that? Because I'm sure it's it's hard to, on a mental health and general well-being scale as well, to sort of listen to those kinds of distressing calls, but also keeping in mind to answer that in a humane and ethical way while also conducting the research. So if any of our panelists have insights on that, we'd be grateful to know that.
This is Neha. I can answer that to begin with. So I think our telephone interviews are only going to start next week because we were waiting for the IRB approval, which has just come through. So we will be able to start the actual survey next week onwards. But what we have prepared for is that we are likely to get these distress calls, right, from women, especially these are pregnant women. They haven't received a lot of the antenatal care services, THR, etc., that they are eligible for and that they should receive in this critical time of their pregnancy. And therefore, we do think that these things are going to come up. What we have prepared for is that so we are in close touch with the community health workers in these areas. So we know exactly who the ANM, ASHA, and Anganwadi worker is for these catchment areas, right? So we know that if there are these distress incidents that are reported to us, we know who we can relay that information to. We are also keeping a track of other NGOs that are working in these areas. Who are offering any kind of relief measures, who are working as volunteers. So we've done a sort of informal mapping of who exists in the field that we can take these concerns to. And then that is the hope that, if we get to hear about these incidents, we know who we can talk to and we know who we can take those concerns to. But of course, there's also a concern about enumerators' mental health, like you said earlier, and I also alluded to that. And I think that is something that we try to keep very closely in touch with our field team, and we have constant calls with them. We are all on WhatsApp with them just to provide support, just to even during the time of the lockdown when they were by themselves and completely in very remote tribal areas of Dholpur and Bharatpur. We try to just have Zoom calls with them all the time, play games with them and have them sing songs. Those kind of activities I think go a long way in sort of keeping them motivated, keeping them sort of positive about what's going on, because their first instinct was we want to go back to our family, right? And so it was sort of the first few weeks we had to spend a lot of time in just sort of talking to them, making them feel comfortable, making sure that they are safe and they have the PPE and everything that they need, if at all they have to go out for essentials and so on. So I think those sort of little things matter a lot when you're planning field work around this time.
I think
Thanks for
one
that.
thing.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Lakshmi, if I
Shruti.
could add, this is Shruti
Yes,
here.
yes.
I think the one thing that we don't have as much time to discuss it today, but one thing to look up, especially for qualitative research, is this idea of trauma-informed methodology, right? So looking at COVID as a traumatic event for everyone involved, whether you're the enumerator or whether you're the respondent, and how can questions be designed and the methodology of asking questions be designed in a way that informs that trauma. And part of it is acknowledging that upfront, right? Just talking about this, these are difficult questions to ask in a difficult time, and working with the respondent, allowing them the space to talk about their experience in this scenario, and then sort of looking at your interview not necessarily from the point of view of your research questions and what you want to ask, but also through the experience and the space that the respondent wants to occur. But for anyone who's interested, do look up some of the techniques that trauma-informed methodology has.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Shruti. I think definitely one of the, what intentions of such, panels is also to have a corpus of resources to kind of address, such situations. So definitely thank you for that. And Kani, I think Apurva has raised a hand, and it would be interesting to get her question because she's our surveyor in Punjab. So
Yeah, she's unmuted. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. So I sort of want to continue on the line that Neha and Shruti were sort of talking about being like having trauma-informed questions and stuff. One thing I wanted to ask about in the context of rapport building a little bit is obviously rapport building is also like a greater challenge because now all of these interviews are happening telephonically. But what happens in scenarios where that sort of rapport building leads to certain like instances of over familiarity or certain instances of like discomfort for the enumerator or the data collector or like the persons we are contacting, the respondents themselves? Mostly just looking, I know this is like a relatively new this thing with how we're adjusting our techniques to COVID, but if any of you have had any anecdotal experience regarding that, I'd be interested to know how you've navigated those situations.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. That's a great question. And the thing is, so for this particular study in Rajasthan, we have already spent significant amount of time meeting them in person, right? Because remember, these are all women that were already recruited in our cohort, and therefore we've had the first round of interview, and in some cases we've had 2 rounds of interview with these women. So they are sort of used to seeing our enumerators because our enumerators spend a lot of initial time building the rapport and connecting with them, and then continuing with the interview with them, and therefore they are sort of familiar because they keep going to these villages all the time, and they're seen around the villages, so women are sort of familiar with them and the rapport is already built. So that might be less of a challenge for us, but I understand that it is complicated if you're doing this for the first time, and if you're sort of talking to women for the first time, and it's going to be a lot more challenging because they don't know you, they can't see you, and so we don't expect that to be a problem for our study as such, but I can imagine that must be hard. So I would be interested in knowing from the others too if there are any techniques or if there is anything that we can keep in mind. If, for example, the women in our cohort are unable to recall who our enumerators are, or the fact that our enumerators have seen them already, that's not, the rapport is not something you can take for granted. So I agree that that might be a challenge.
Thanks. Akash, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was mainly for some of the previous questions where I was unmuted. So yeah, I think on the enumerator front, definitely one thing that we've learned, and I think this was a question by Aapti as well, is how this has altered our outlook of research. Is I think it's given us a much stronger empathy for both our enumerators and our respondents, and I think that's something that needs to become potentially something that's even seen as a standardized bare minimum that all organizations ought to do. I think some of the things that we've tried to do at a first level is making sure that there is fair compensation for the respondents' time. I think often we do surveys where we don't provide the respondents any compensation, even though we might take considerable amount of their time. So try to have things like mobile recharges for our respondents. I think the one challenge in India, unlike Africa, is that we don't have as ubiquitous a digital payment platform as something like M-Pesa, wherein you can provide direct transfers to respondents, and you have to rely on mobile recharges. So that's one thing that we're hoping improves over time. The second piece around empathy, I think a lot of great ideas from the other panelists, and some of those are things that we've been looking into as well, is are there other organizations who are supporting individuals in distress? I think the one thing I would add to that is making sure that the questionnaires or the forms that different surveys are filling out should have an explicit question where surveyors are recording whether the respondent is in distress, so that in the future, if you come across resources that can be shared, then at least you have data on who to share that with. The other thing that we've been thinking about is like once you have like numbers of people who are in distress and you come up with more information, you don't always need to call them. You can use other methods like IVR or text messages to send out potential sources of relief.
Yeah, if I can just add to that. So in our case, for the enumerators, we are making sure that they're not calling from their personal phones, right? So they are all given a separate SIM card just for these interviews. And we try and tell them not to encourage callbacks, because then, you know, if like you were saying earlier, if the respondents get over familiar with our enumerators and want to, you know, call them, and we're also concerned about the enumerator safety, right? Because these phone numbers can get into the wrong hands, and then, you know, they'll start getting a lot of unwarranted calls. And so we have told them not to take calls on that particular phone card at all, and we're making sure that they're getting a separate phone card that we can track at all times. You know, and they know that they have to report to us if they get any kind of spurious calls on that card, or if they get any sort of unsafe or sort of problematic callbacks. But that's something that comes as a part of our ethics training to the enumerators, because we also want to make sure they are safe. The other thing that they can do for the respondents is also send them over WhatsApp possibly any new sort of government guidelines on information related to COVID that might be useful for these women, right? So for example, if there are new guidelines about antenatal care services that have partially resumed in these particular areas, they can possibly share the government of Rajasthan guidelines with these women on their phones, so that it's not just getting data from them, but also giving them some help in case they want to know where to go, in case they want to know what kind of services are available to them now under the unlocking situation. And so I think that is a good way of sort of also giving them some relevant information that they can use later.
Thanks for that. So I'll just quickly bring up a couple of questions we've got from, I think, some Hargun and Prashansa as well. It's mostly about lack of infrastructure, lack of access to infrastructure like telephones or smartphones or you know, other digital you know, products that give you that you need to be part of such conversations or be participants of such researches. So how do we address further representative bias when reaching out to people who may not have this sort of digital infrastructure and therefore cannot be part of this research? So how are you addressing these kinds of representation issues?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. So I think the way we've been thinking about it is two ways. I think the first is how do we limit the non-response as much as possible? So there, what we've been trying to do is that making sure that when we did our in-person activities, we collected as many phone numbers for a household as possible, made sure those phone numbers were double entered so that they're more likely to be correct. And also doing a lot of experimentation to figure out best times of day, how many times we should call. So that's to try and limit non-response in the first place. But I think everyone's correct that there is a harsh reality that we are going to see non-response due to factors like lack of internet connectivity, lack of mobile access, people just not being available at that time. So on that, essentially, so far we've been trying to address that through sampling weights. So weighing, attaching weights to respondents in terms of these certain characteristics. So there's two ways we've tried to do this. The first is through post-stratification weights. So what we've tried to do is look at what are the characteristics of the population and how that is distributed, and then try and adjust the sample that we've collected based on those characteristics. So weighting up or weighting down certain populations that are underrepresented. The second thing that we're trying to do and have done in the past is looking at non-response corrections. So seeing who are the attritors or who are the people who have not responded, what are the characteristics that they are showing, building a model around that, and then trying to overweight or underweight similar populations from our sample. So we've tried to do these type of weighting measures to adjust for that non-response. And so far, we feel very comfortable with the estimates that we've been able to generate using those weights. But yeah, I think this is in general something that warrants a lot more discussion and collaboration on how can we improve the scope of weights. Are there other secondary data sets that can be made accessible to each other? So I think there's definitely scope for collaboration and more work on this.
Thanks. Does anybody else want to take that question? I think it's also about the fact that we are missing out on an entire section of population that don't have access to any of this digital infrastructure, be it internet or, you know, we're going in with a certain assumption that they have, you know, it's not a smartphone, a regular phone at least. So we're missing out on population that might not have that as well. And that's something that I think is a limitation in my perspective, and also in the perspective of the research that we're doing right now. And even within a population that have cell phones, you have certain, I think Shruti brought this up, you know, women may not have the same access to the family mobile phone as a male member. So you tend to lose out that, you know, group. So I think these are concerns that we are still navigating, and, you know, if anybody wants to take that question up further, we can do that. But before that, I just want to, you know, since we're almost out of time, I just want to quickly touch upon the final discussion point about whether do the constraints of the pandemic provide potential avenues for innovation to field research methodology. And I think that's something that Shruti mentioned, you know, this innovation bit about how when you're talking about especially sensitive issues like, you know, domestic abuse, using alternative words or code words to sort of address that, so that this issue is not, you know, falling through the cracks, it's getting addressed and the questions are being asked. I think that's an innovative strategy. And also something that Akash mentioned, going forward, you know, in the post-pandemic world, what are the, you know, insights that we have learned from this phase of things that we want to continue with, whether it's about a more holistic well-being of all the people involved in a research piece, from the designers to the enumerators to the intermediary partners like NGOs or local community-based partners, and also finally, and most importantly, the last mile participants. So I think, you know, if we could get, you know, closing remarks on this, what are we going to take forward? What are we going to leave behind? And what are the ways this has sort of honed your research chops, as it were? Anybody can take this question. Yeah.
So okay, go ahead, Shruti, you first.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so one thing that that is interesting to me, and especially from, you know, what I heard about panelists who are actually continuing with the surveys on the field, is the ability to make inferences using a reduced questionnaire. So, you know, in the best of times, going and taking 45 minutes to 1 hour of anyone's time and asking the multiple questions that we always, once you start, you don't want to stop because you want to capture as much information as possible. I think even in the best of times, that's quite an ask. And it would be very interesting to see how we are doing with reduced questionnaires, 10-minute questionnaires, 15-minute questionnaires. What is it that they can give us? What is it that they don't give us? And how feasible is it to continue with shorter questionnaires over time? And of course, I understand that there are certain topics where you can't do it in 20 minutes or 10 minutes, right? It requires a far more intense, conversation and multiple conversations and all of that. But I'm sure that there are certain areas where we can just leverage on these shorter, shorter questionnaires and move ahead. And I think the other interesting question to me is, to what extent should we be continuing with just phone surveys instead of doing in-person surveys? So, are we going to go back to a place where we continue to do these long in-person surveys, or can we move to another kind of equilibrium where a lot of this just happens on phone or IVR or online, if your sample is, internet savvy, and those are the kinds of questions that you're asking. How do we then scale so that we don't have to go into the field for the quantitative stuff? I appreciate that for a lot of qualitative stuff, you have to go into the field, and a lot of insights come because you do focus group discussions or qualitative surveys. But I think both these things are something that are learnings that we should take forward into the post-COVID world whenever we get there.
Thanks for that. Shruti, do you want to take it up?
Sure. I'm just gonna, I really, sort of want to echo what Renuka said. I don't want to add, I don't have anything new to add to that there. But I think something that Renuka mentioned in her opening remarks that I sort of want to make sure I close with, right? Which is looking at secondary data, looking at representative questionnaires or interviews, right? I think it's a good point of reflection for the development and policy sector as a whole. I think over the past, and of course my personal opinion, that over the past 5 to 8 years, we've become a little trigger happy with how many questionnaires and qualitative and quantitative research we conduct. A few years ago, I was in Bihar speaking to an Anganwadi worker, and in her responsibility, she listed speaking to people who come and ask me, like researchers who come and ask me questions, right? And at any given point anywhere, we're having multiple qualitative and quantitative research studies by different organizations. And I think this has been in some ways a good reality check to think about what is actually necessary, what sort of insights can we have from reduced interviews, reduced questionnaires, and what other secondary, administrative, other types of data that exist there that can help us guide policy innovation and answers to tough questions there, right? And I think the one thing that I would really like to see for the sector as a whole is coming together in terms of sharing primary data, something we just don't do enough of. So many studies about very similar questions, and yet we continue to ask the same ones over and over again. So if there's a way for us to talk about sharing primary data more easily so that we don't all have to run surveys and qualitative studies all the time.
That's a very good point. I think especially even within the development research space, there's this race to get the primary data, and I think we put a lot of onus on the participants in when we're doing that. And there is definitely, in my own experience in doing field research, there's definitely this mistrust and sort of cynicism towards researchers in general, because it's a data mining sort of operation almost, and people are well aware of that. And I think if we spend more time in sharing, having a more collaborative approach in general in the research ecosystem, that would have a lot of good implications for everybody in the ecosystem, and especially the last mile participants. I think this has been an extremely productive, session for me, for sure, and everybody who's hopefully for everybody who attended. And I want to say that we'll be putting out a feedback document, documenting all the insights we've had over this session. We'll be sharing that through our Twitter feed and to everybody who registered. We have a mailing list. And we look forward to continuing this engagement in future roundtables and talking about, very important and pertinent questions for the research community. And I thank all of the panelists for being part of this. Yes, and I think at that note, we are at our time. So look forward to our emails and tweets. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.